He said, I have signed all the other actors, and they're all in the pilot, and you were not, and you will have to be in last position. I said, well, I'm not going to be very comfortable with that. Then he turned to the casting man, who was also in the office, and he said, sign him up, and don't pay him too much money.
A robot getting drunk on tequila. A $600,000 pilot locked in a vault for 30 years. A beloved TV villain who was originally scripted to die a cold-blooded killer. These aren't rumors. They're documented, on-the-record facts about one of the strangest family shows CBS ever put on the air, and today we're pulling all three of them out of the archive. In the fall of 1965, CBS launched the Robinson family into deep space and, almost overnight, turned a science fiction pilot into a cultural phenomenon. Lost in Space would run for 83 episodes across 3 seasons, spawn a merchandising empire, and give American children a Wednesday night ritual built around laser pistols, alien monsters, and a blinking robot who couldn't stop insulting his least favorite passenger. But underneath the shiny production values and the Saturday morning nostalgia, there's a messier history. Episodes that certain stations quietly refused to air. Footage that sat unseen for decades. A leading character who was almost written out of the show entirely before an actor took the script into his own hands. This is the story of how far a family-friendly space adventure could push things before the people in charge of putting it on the air started pulling back. Let's start with the episode that actually earned itself a ban, in the most literal sense the word can carry on American television. By its 3rd season, Lost in Space had drifted a long way from its original premise. What began as a tense survival story about a stranded family had turned into something closer to a weekly costume party, full of space pirates, talking vegetables, and planetary warlords. Somewhere in the middle of that shift, on December 20th, 1967, the show aired an episode called Castles in Space. On paper, it's a fairly simple runaway story. Dr. Smith accidentally thaws out a frozen alien princess named Reika, and the family has to protect her from the bounty hunter who's been sent to drag her back. It's the kind of plot the show had run a dozen times by that point. What made this episode different was the bounty hunter himself. The character, named Chavo, was played by character actor Alberto Monte in silver skin makeup, a giant sombrero, crossed bandoliers, and a heavily exaggerated accent. Critics who've revisited the episode over the decades have described Chavo bluntly as a chrome-plated version of the old Frito Bandito caricature, dropped into outer space with no explanation for why an alien would look and sound like a Hollywood stereotype of a Mexican outlaw. The episode leans hard into it, too. In one now infamous scene, Chavo pours tequila into the robot's internal sensors to loosen his tongue, and the robot spends the rest of the episode stumbling around drunk before nursing what is played, for laughs, as a hangover. The timing could not have been worse for the network. The episode aired right as public criticism of exactly this kind of caricature, most famously the Frito Bandito advertising mascot, was picking up steam in the media. According to contemporary reviews and episode records, several Los Angeles area television stations made the decision not to air Castles in Space once it hit the syndication circuit, pulling it from rotation because of how Chavo was portrayed. It's a rare, concrete example of local affiliates actively refusing to run a network rerun over its content, rather than simply scheduling around it. The episode never vanished completely, and today you can find it on official DVD and streaming releases alongside the rest of the series, so calling it banned in the present tense would be an overstatement. But the fact remains, this is one of the very few Lost in Space episodes with a documented, station-level refusal to broadcast it, and watching it today, it's not hard to see exactly why some programmers in 1968 didn't want their names attached to it. If a single-character caricature was enough to get an episode quietly pulled from some stations, imagine what happened when an entire pilot, one that cost more than any TV pilot ever produced up to that point, didn't even make it to broadcast in the first place. Before there was a reluctant stowaway, before there was a scheming Dr. Smith, and before there was a wisecracking robot, there was a completely different version of this story, one that almost nobody saw for nearly 40 years. In 1965, producer Irwin Allen pitched CBS executive James Aubrey on a serious, grounded science fiction drama about a pioneer family sent to colonize a planet in the Alpha Centauri system. With backing from CBS, 20th Century Fox, and even entertainer Red Skelton, Allen was handed a budget of roughly $600,000, the equivalent of several $1 million today, and at the time the most expensive television pilot ever produced. The result was a black-and-white episode called No Place to Hide. The story followed the Robinson family and a young astronomy graduate named Don West aboard a single-deck ship called the Gemini 12, on a mission to reach Alpha Centauri in suspended animation. A meteor storm throws the ship off course, and the crew wakes up years later, crash-landed on a harsh, unfamiliar planet, where they have to survive freezing weather, a hostile giant cyclops, and a perilous crossing of an inland sea. It's a straightforward, fairly grim survival story, shot with real technical ambition for 1965 television. And critically, it's missing the two characters who would go on to define the entire franchise. There is no Dr. Smith. There is no robot. No saboteur, no comic relief, nobody for young Will to banter with. CBS never aired it. Instead of putting the $600,000 pilot on the air as filmed, the network sent Owen Allen back to the drawing board, this time with a mandate to build in a recurring antagonist and a mechanical companion for the family. Much of the footage from No Place to Hide was recycled directly into the first 5 broadcast episodes of the series, redressed and reshot around new scenes featuring Smith and the robot, which is part of why the finished pilot was never released as a standalone episode. Large chunks of it were already baked into episodes audiences had already seen. The original cut sat in the studio archive, unseen by the public, until it finally surfaced decades later on home video and, eventually, on the Internet Archive. It's a strange footnote in television history, the most expensive pilot of its era, effectively erased from the timeline by its own recycled footage, only to resurface as a curiosity for hardcore fans who wanted to see the version of the show that almost was. With the network demanding a villain to replace the tone that No Place to Hide was missing, the show needed someone to fill that role fast. What they got was a character who was originally supposed to be dead within 6 episodes, and whose entire future on the show came down to one actor quietly rewriting his own part. Enter Dr. Zachary Smith, played by veteran character actor Jonathan Harris, and introduced in the very first broadcast episode, The Reluctant Stowaway. If you go back and actually watch that premiere, the Dr. Smith on screen is almost nothing like the bumbling, cowardly figure most people remember. He's a cold, calculating foreign agent who sneaks aboard the Jupiter 2 and reprograms the robot to sabotage the ship systems, a plan that backfires when he gets trapped on board during launch. According to Bill Mumy, who played young Will Robinson, the character was originally written to be killed off completely, with plans in place for Smith to die within roughly the first 6 episodes of the series. Harris played the part exactly as written in those early scripts, manipulative, dangerous, and genuinely willing to let the family die if it served his mission. What changed the show's direction wasn't a network memo or a re-edit. It was Harris himself. As he explained in interviews later in his life, he recognized early on that a straightforward, irredeemable villain has a short shelf life on a weekly family program. Sooner or later, the story either has to kill him off or write him out, and either way, his job disappears. So, starting in those first handful of episodes, Harris began quietly reshaping his own dialogue, layering in the theatrical cowardice, the pompous vocabulary, and the now famous alliterative insults aimed at the robot, like calling him a bubble-headed booby, that had never been part of the character on the page. Producers noticed the audience response, and rather than stick to the original plan of killing Smith off, they let Harris keep rewriting. Owen Allen eventually gave him what amounted to creative carte blanche over the character. The result is that the darker, more lethal version of Dr. Smith never got a full episode-length outing beyond those first few installments. The scripts that would have shown him following through on sabotage, on real violence, on the kind of Cold War espionage plot the network originally greenlit, were quietly abandoned before they were ever filmed, replaced by the pompous, cowardly anti-hero who became the emotional center of the entire series. It's a strange kind of vanishing act, not a banned episode in the traditional sense, but an entire planned arc for the show's most famous character that got scrapped in real time and never saw the light of day, because the man playing him decided the villain he was hired to play simply wasn't going to work. Taken together, these 3 stories say something interesting about how television actually gets made, and how much of what audiences never saw shaped the show they did. A regional ban over an offensive caricature that still lingers on the show's reputation decades later. A $600,000 pilot so tonally different from what came after that the network essentially buried it inside other episodes rather than let it stand on its own. And a villain's entire intended fate, quietly rewritten out of existence by the man who was supposed to play him straight. None of it stopped Lost in Space from becoming a genuine phenomenon, one that dominated its Wednesday night time slot, spun off a merchandising empire, and eventually landed in permanent syndication rotation for generations of kids who never knew any of this history existed behind the scenes. Television critics in the late 1960s were often merciless toward the show, dismissing its later seasons as juvenile camp dressed up in silver spacesuits. But audiences kept tuning in anyway, because underneath the talking carrots and the galactic warlords, There was a family that stuck together no matter how strange the planet got, and a supporting cast, Smith, the robot, and young Will, that critics couldn't quite explain the appeal of but viewers couldn't get enough of. More than half a century later, the version of the show we remember exists specifically because of the choices, the compromises, and in a few cases the outright bans, that reshaped it before, during, and after it reached the air. If you found this dive into the hidden history of Lost in Space interesting, there's a lot more buried in the archives of classic television just like it. So stick around and subscribe for the next